You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. Welcoming back Slava Rabinovich, our regular guest and analyst, and one of the most popular and well-read people on social media in Russia with over 110,000 subscribers, which means that there's something and a lot that people are finding in Slava's posts. Slava, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Yuri.
I wanted to talk to you. This is we're nearing the end of the year, and so I was thinking, as we look back over this fairly eventful year, maybe not as eventful as some, but maybe just as meaningful and relevant to and important to what we're going to be seeing in the future, as far as certain trends that either increased or started, as well as some individual events, including very much so just yesterday's killing of Russian ambassador in Turkey. What, in your opinion, do you see as some of the main events that matter from 2016?
Yuri, you, of course, would like to get my spin on the kind of summary of what happened in 2016, as most people enjoy reading and listening or watching some kind of an end-of-the-year closing program on something.
It is December.
And, yes, and it is quite different from a year ago, and it so happened that I was searching for something on my Facebook under keywords. Was searching for a certain post that I written, and I knew that I was using those keywords, and I came across a post from December of 2015 with my predictions over to 2016 and giving some summary of what had happened in 2015 by then. 2016 is indeed a different year in that sense. There is no more hot phase of aggression in Ukraine by Putin and his gang. Putin has lost this seemingly fascist battle and seemingly fascist ideology altogether, which was called Novorossiya, where he publicly announced his intentions to basically annex the about half of entire Ukraine in the eastern part of it. That has vanished, and there is no rhetoric whatsoever. However, Putin did change gears, and he did switch the state-owned propaganda machine into some other topic. He is fond of changing gears, and he is fond of changing agenda for the Russian population, which is being zombied and hypnotized by the state media. And that new switch was to get the attention away from his battle that he lost in Ukraine to Syria, which has nothing to do with Russia. And when, in fact, it started having something to do with Russia, it certainly has nothing to do with the war against ISIS. And that was probably the overriding theme in terms of the Syrian scenario of leading 140 plus million people away from both domestic issues and most other international issues. Obviously, the February of 2015 murder of Boris Nemtsov, the most prominent Russian opposition politician in a kind of murder of extreme showcase violence in 100 meters away from the Kremlin walls in the direct vicinity of Putin's office in the Kremlin, under 30-plus video cameras operated by the presidential security teams, and still unresolved case of his murder. This was 2015. In 2016, we did not have this kind of or similar violence, but we had absolutely disgusting, illegal, and violent rhetoric against the Russian opposition figures and Russian opposition parties right before the so-called parliamentary elections. These were not elections at all. They were rigged from A to Z in the entire process of what the elections are all about. They were neither democratic nor fair, and they were rigged. And so the ruling so-called party, and I'm saying so-called, quote-unquote, because this is not really a party, and just the mixture of KGB and old Soviet-style bureaucrats that created this strange organ, which is calling itself a party. So they got a constitutional majority in this puppet parliament, and all their other small parties that have been sitting in the parliament all those years, they are as puppet-like parties as the main one. And no real opposition parties have been allowed to come even close to the doors of this parliament. And we, of course, in 2016, we have some preview of what perhaps may happen in 2018 with the new presidential elections, which so far seem to be in a similar category as the so-called elections to the so-called parliament this year. I think that the overall temperature is a bit lower, but I am also puzzled and totally, I would say, even disgusted as a citizen that Russian nation does not exist, and Russian people keep silent and keep inactive in an environment where 20 plus million people already live below the poverty level, where the almost entire population sees their real incomes going down third year in a row, where there is absolutely no end to the political and economic crisis. There is no plan for dealing with this crisis, and the country lives with no internationally recognized borders. And there is absolutely no plan how to deal with this. And in fact, there is, there isn't any plan by definition, because these people in the Kremlin, they can't really have any plan. They are engaged in something else. It's just an unlimited pillage of the country, lining up their pockets in unprecedented ways that the world has not seen before, and there is absolutely clear stance on their part that they will never be stripped of power. And of course, under these circumstances, they cannot have any reasonable plan or any plan whatsoever to deal with worsening economic and political situation and with the isolation of the country. And as I said, given all that, the Russian nation doesn't exist as a nation. There is it's just a population which is scattered across the vast lands and concentrated in large cities, but still scattered in their apartment blocks, and they just do nothing. And I'm surprised at the complete lack of any activity on the part of the population, and I'm very disappointed that the Russian nation, as a nation, proved to be non-existent.
Slava, it's certainly, you're certainly making very good points. However, on the issue of Russian nation, from my observation, it seems that there are any efforts at, let's say, energizing Russian nation in Russia are perceived and immediately labeled as nationalists. And those are people that, as far as I can tell, Kremlin is very much at war with, and most of their leaders are in prison. So it's a movement that is not even allowed to develop. And people who I feel are a more liberal end of things, progressive, community, is concerned that they are also going to be nationalists in a sense of like race wars or something like that. And some of them clearly are. But I think because there's this muddied water about who are nationalists and who are people who are trying to energize Russian nation and get people to hold their government accountable to them, I think that's kind of where that idea dies in Russia these days. But I didn't mean to make that kind of a big point, but it just kind of stood out to me, something from what you were saying.
Well, you raise a good question, but it's somewhat biased, again, by probably non-existent facts and propaganda that was spread out not only in Russia but even outside of Russia. Let's have an experiment of democratic, fair, and honest elections, and I think that nationalists will not be supported by the population at large if we indeed did have the elections from A to Z. I refer to the process, what elections encompass, and I think that the example of Ukraine back in 2014 serves as a good lead to show what the population at large may vote for. If you remember, there were elections held in Ukraine for the Ukrainian parliament in October of 2014 after several months after Yanukovych was ousted, in fact, fled the country, and several months after the so-called Euromaidan that they had, a revolution. And the Nationalist Party or nationalist parties altogether received something like less than 1% of the vote and seats in the government, where a Jewish multi-billionaire Vadim Rabinovich, with the same last name as mine, although we're not related, won something like 3 times as much votes than all of the nationalist parties combined, and he did not even campaign properly. It was a very short and very inexpensive campaign for him. So if people in Ukraine, and there are 40 million people there, I don't know exactly how many eligible voters registered in Ukraine. I think, we can easily say that, over 20 million probably, for sure. So it's a good statistical sample that this marginal nationalist parties or even mainstream nationalist parties do not have a huge following among the voters. So it's this so-called strashilka in Russian, which is like something
like
that
a scarecrow.
Exactly. So I think that's the answer to your question. We would never find out until we have the fair and democratic elections, but we can use the scarecrow for not having them ever.
By using the nationalist movement as a scarecrow, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Right. And, I think it also means foreign involvement as Ukraine has experienced, but that's we have such limited time today, and I really want to hit on several other things. But the idea, because I had a great conversation with Vitaly Portnikov. Unfortunately for our English listeners, that was in Russian. And he was pointing out the birth of Ukrainian nation that came because of this situation with the war in eastern Ukraine and Crimea and so forth. And Maidan, of course, is that now there's people of different nationalities who identify themselves as Ukrainian because of those events. It's kind of like they became stockholders, active stockholders in their corporation, I guess is how I compare it to. And Russian people just so far, from what you're saying, Slava, are refusing to take ownership in their corporation.
Well, I enjoy reading and listening to Vitaly Portnikov, and he said, of course, very right things about that. I said the same thing back in 2014. Ukrainian people have Putin to thank for nation building that he started. And he is almost like the founding father of the Ukrainian nation, regardless of ethnicity and nationality on the ethnic basis.
So Moscow will have a giant does have a giant statue of Knyaz Count of Vladimir to take its roots back from Ukraine, and Ukraine could have a big statue of Putin as the father of the nation. That could be quite ironic. All right. Really, I want to shift to other things. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. I'm excited, as you can tell, to be joined by Slava Rabinovich, directly from Slava, are you in Moscow?
Moscow right now.
Yes, you're in Moscow right now.
Just arrived yesterday.
Oh, welcome back to Russia, right. And we're speaking about end of the year ideas for this is a December conversation. And also I wanted to touch on the fact that there's, from American point of view, when we look at Russia, the concern keeps going back to because Russia all of a sudden is now on the front pages of our news. As you saw, Saturday Night Live, has Putin almost like as a regular character now and always shirtless. That's how we know it's Putin. But the question is of seriousness. How serious is the idea that Kremlin is hacking us? Should we dismiss it from this side of the ocean as politics as usual, or is there a bigger threat that you think we should be aware of that comes from this hacking?
No, you should not be dismissing this at all. It should be investigated and dealt with all the power that the United States of America have. And the calls that I hear from the Congress and the Senate floors about this, to follow up what CIA and FBI are talking about. This is what needs to be done in order for America to preserve its democracy, its integrity, and its constitution, and its way of life. And I'm disappointed that President Obama turned out to be not the right leader to deal with the new or resurrected evil empire as it is once again in existence in the world, headed up by a former KGB colonel. And most of the Obama's actions over the last 2+ years have been inadequate, as I see. I see it in dealing with Putin's Russia. And we are yet to see what Trump administration would do in this regard. But again, all of the things that Trump said in his pre-election campaign doesn't give me good expectations on how America will be dealing with this kind of threat. And Russia is a threat. It's not a fake threat. It's not imaginary threat. It's threat that materialized in Russia waging a war against Georgia in 2008, waging a war against Ukraine in 2014, annexing a part of Ukrainian territory, which has never happened in Europe since World War II.
But why does it matter to us here in the United States, I think, is a question that a lot of people find themselves asking. Because especially for Trump voters who feel like world order, and that's what Russia is breaking, is really existing world order, wasn't such a hot thing to begin with, because it sounds like it's some big entity oppressing everybody. So what's the harm to us?
Well, you can try to sit back and enjoy, and then see what happens after that. You can draw a parallel to 1938, for example, and ask yourself whether the United States would have been better off dealing with Hitler as they did, or actually confronting Hitler back then. What would have been the stakes, higher or lower, if the U.S. would have not had this unconfrontational stance in 1938. It is absolutely clear to me that Russia in 2014-2016 is the country of rising fascist power that is similar to some of the regimes in the past, just before the World War II broke out. It has some elements of Nazi Germany, it has some elements of fascist Spain, it has some elements of fascist Italy. And the US, of course, can continue along the same path, but I think that in the future it will run into a much higher cost of dealing with Russia when it would be too late to extinguish something that the U.S. could have done before. And also, on top of that, if Russia breaks into the election system in the U.S., it is, I think it's unprecedented in terms of the U.S. history. It was obviously somewhat with precedence vice versa. The United States of America influenced some of the elections around the world over the course of the 20th century. But the U.S. has never had any real attacks on its own constitution and on its electoral process, and this is another precedent right now. So the proposal is to do nothing. Well, I think that it's when you talk about the institution of presidency in the United States. That's what leaders are for. The leadership is a part of a job description of a U.S. president. So neither Obama nor Trump seem to be realizing what leadership in this respect is all about.
Then what, well, I mean, I can kind of imagine that direction, that if we are strong, a strong leader would have stronger sanctions. You're not necessarily advocating war with Russia. You're just saying that stronger sanctions would remedy the situation. That's at least that's what you said in the past. But I think Pearl Harbor is an important point, because if we are not attacked, if we had the United States were not attacked in Pearl Harbor in 1941, there's lots of historians that would argue that we wouldn't even be, I think, in World War II, or at least we would definitely enter at a different point. If Putin doesn't explicitly attack us, of course, had Hillary Clinton been elected, I suppose she could have considered this to be a serious attack, because Donald Trump doesn't seem to treat it as such. So who knows? What can we expect?
Well, I don't want to get into the argument here of alternative history, although I kind of started it with you. The possibility of somebody breaking into the electoral system in the U.S. is really a thing of the 21st century and of the hybrid war that Russia is waging. And if you believe that Pearl Harbor was something of a different sort back in during the World War II, then I would argue that the current hybrid war that Putin is waging is on the same scale as Pearl Harbor, although it's not on the battlefield, neither at sea nor at the land, but it's a real war. And
in that case, the war is underway.
It has started over 2 years ago, of course, or some would argue that it started with the so-called Munich speech of Putin back in 2007, although he did not proceed with his ideas straight away. But definitely the war against Georgia was probably a clear beginning for delivering on what he said in his Munich speech, and obviously the 2014 war against Ukraine and all other unbelievable things that he has done in the world, including Syria, including all international propaganda, including all this hybrid war ways and means of waging a war. This is by no doubt it is a third world war of a hybrid type. And in fact, it is, many leaders in many countries and many people around the world do not understand that, because they have never seen anything like that, because, centuries and thousands of years of human civilization did not see examples of such hybrid wars. These were like physical wars. And this is like the first time that we see serious consequences, very serious consequences because of this hybrid war that Putin is waging.
Slava, it seems like we're doing nothing but singing praises of Mr. Putin. He is the father of Ukrainian nation. He is the father of this new kind of warfare. In 1,000 years, could be quite an interesting character. I think in the end, there's a lot of we will lack a lot of clarity because we don't know what President Trump is going to do for certain. So, as you are a person that is, I think, fairly known for making some accurate predictions about, some rational things, what do you expect to happen in 2017?
Well, as I said before, I think in our previous conversation, it's getting more and more difficult to make predictions because it is more and more clear that all institutions that in some shape or form should have been functioning, at least on the surface, seem to be completely dead. And if you lack all the institutions that comprise the state, if you have a failing state, it is impossible to make prediction of what will happen to it because of no institutions which comprise that state. I honestly don't know what will happen. We don't have not only the division of judicial power, parliamentary power, and executive power. In fact, we don't have these branches of power at all. These were just they were made a mockery of these branches of power. We have a full-scale dictatorship combined with state capitalism, which transferred itself into bandit neo-feudalism, and Putin is holding on to power not only for the sake of power, but for the sake of his life and freedom. And I think that he can only give up power in case he is dead. Whether it's going to be a natural death or not a natural death of natural causes. So in 2017 is the year preceding the presidential elections of 2018. And it is, at least now, seems to be that Putin would like to install himself again on the throne for the next 6 years. And it is absolutely unclear to me whether there is this there are internal resources in Russia which are capable of organizing some sort of a palace coup. If there is no palace coup, it is difficult for me to see that in 2018 there will be a different president. And yet, at the same time, it is difficult for me to see Putin sitting through 2024 because the entire country is running on unsustainable political and economic platform. It is going to collapse in some way or another. But that's the whole problem with ask the guys like Nassim Taleb, with his theory of a black swan. I think that the more we go further down that path of very shaky, unpredictable situation in Russia, the more we have a probability of a black swan being some kind of a catalyst to the disintegration of the whole system as in a house of cards. And therefore, some people would predict that Putin will sit through 2024. Some would say that he will be assassinated tomorrow. But these scenarios, I think, have same probability weighting in a million of other scenarios that we just are unable to predict just because we went too far along the disintegration of the state.
So I guess black swans matter.
Yes, they do, but it's the whole point is that black swans are events that is impossible to predict, and therefore we cannot predict the events, and we cannot predict the consequences.
Absolutely. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. Slava Rabinovich, thank you so much for being once again on the program.
Thank you, Yuri.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to Rashkin Report.